Welcome you lucky people to Photography Fundamentals, a roller coaster ride through the important aspects of photography. But before I start this session, I think it's important that you ask this question of yourself. What would you like to get out of this session? I feel if you do ask yourself this question, it means you're more likely to engage with the session. And hopefully it will give you an understanding of where your learning journey needs to go next. Don't worry, I'll remind you about this at the end of the session and ask you, did you get out of it what you wanted? I've split the photography fundamentals into 6 topics. These are the exposure triangle, what's a stop, depth of field, freezing and blurring movement, panning, and avoiding camera shake. I asked photography students if they've heard of any of these topics, and most have heard of exposure triangle, everyone's heard of depth of field, but rarely do people hear of avoiding camera shake. And it's a shame because I think this is very important information because it's quite often the thing that kills your photography. It's also very important to know that the information I give over the 6 topics of the photography fundamentals are the same whether you're using film or digital cameras as well. So let's begin. The first topic, part 1, the exposure triangle. After this session, you'll have an understanding of the following. Well, I think that's a bit of much to ask, having an understanding. So let's say after this session you'll have heard of the following. That's the exposure triangle, film speed, aperture and shutter speed, and obviously correct exposure. So exposure triangle, what do I mean? Well, it's the relationship between 3 elements that make up an exposure. And I hear you cry, but what's an exposure, Dave? Well, that's the light that actually reaches the sensor or film. And that's determined by 2 factors. 1, the level of available light, and 2, the sensitivity of your sensor or film. Now, available light, that's the light around you. It could be the sun, a table lamp, a television, or even a laptop or mobile phone. These are all potential light sources. And then the sensitivity is how quick your sensor or film reacts to light. So factor 1, the level of available light. This is measured by an in-camera light meter or a handheld light meter. And these are controlled by the shutter and the aperture. These actually control the physical amount of light hitting your film or sensor. Factor 2, that's the sensitivity of the film or sensor. The film, it's a fixed ISO, so you buy a speed of film, either 400 or 125 or even 3200 speed film. Digital, it's changeable ISO. You can change it from shot to shot to shot, okay? This one is set to 400 at the moment. And the exposure is a product of these 3 things. The size of the aperture that controls the intensity of that light reaching the film or sensor. The shutter speed, this controls the time that light has acting on the film or the sensor. And then the ISO, that controls how sensitive the film or sensor is to light. And these 3 things together are called the exposure triangle. ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. And notice how I've introduced f-stop, because f-stop is aperture, aperture is f-stop. They are the things that control the intensity of light hitting the film or sensor. And the most important factor about the exposure triangle is this. Once you have the correct exposure, if you want to change one of these, another one must be changed to keep the same exposure. In other words, if you want to change one, you have to change another one to keep the same amount of light hitting that sensor. Why would you want to change, you are asking me? Well, if you look at one of the other PowerPoints, then I will explain the reasons for wanting to change a shutter speed or an aperture or indeed the ISO. The correct exposure is a tiny margin, so let's get it right. You can, people say, oh, I can fix it in Photoshop later. It doesn't matter too much. And yeah, that is true in some respects, but it's much better to get it right in camera, because I can guarantee you that the one time you really want to get it right, you can't correct it in Photoshop. And more importantly, if you do under or overexpose your shots, mainly underexposing, you'll get more noise and it will reduce contrast in shadow areas. So let's get it right in the camera. So let's look at the three elements of the exposure triangle. And let's start with the aperture, the hole in the lens. The aperture, the f-stop, this controls how much light passes through the lens. So a big hole, that's going to allow lots of light through. And a small hole, that's going to let a small amount of light through. And so we know which hole we're using, we give those holes a name, and it's called an f-stop number. Now, some say that the f-stop number is actually the relationship of the diameter of the aperture to the focal length of the lens. It's a calculation. I personally think they sat down and went, right, we have a big hole. Do we give it a small number or a large number? I know. If we give it a small number, that will confuse Dave. And you know what? It still does to this day. So I'm actually going to tell you something else in a later PowerPoint in one of the other topics, something else about these numbers. So look out for it. The other way of looking at it is that this is like the human eye. And when we have loads of light, we close that pupil down so it's very small. And then we have not much light, we open our pupil up. And the aperture lens is doing very similar things to that. Now you've been staring at this for a few seconds now, and you've probably realised that these two holes are the wrong way round. Now, is that a very clever teaching tool by Dave, or did he just put them together wrong? I'll let you decide on that, but this hole is the f16 and this hole is the f22. And I've done this chart to give you some information about third stop increments. Everyone always knows or should know the full stops, 2.8, 4, 5, 6 and 8. And people think they have to use these f-stop numbers, when in reality they don't. They can use any of these that are found on your digital SLR. As long as it's letting in the right amount of light. You can use 7.1, 6.3, it doesn't matter. The next one is shutter speed, how long that hole is open for. Now shutter speed controls the time that light is allowed to pass through your lens. The shutter is adjusted by the shutter speed dial. Here's one on a Nikon camera, here's one on a Canon camera, and these two are on old film cameras. And shutter speeds have a great range, ranging from about 30 seconds all the way through to 8,000th of a second on some digital SLRs. Most of the images shot on these PowerPoints were shot on a Canon 6D, and that has a maximum shutter speed of 4,000th of a second. Now 30 seconds is an incredibly long time photographically, but if you wanted to go even longer than 30 seconds, then we have B for bulb. And bulb setting is as long as your finger stays on the shutter release button, the shutter stays open. This allows for very long exposures. But do watch out for camera movement, camera shake, so use a tripod. And again, here's a chart just showing you third stop increments. Most people know these, 100th, 125th of a second, 250th of a second. But again, these are third stop increments, and you can use any of these as long as it's allowing the right amount of light. Now this one's in here only to show you the beautiful graphic I've made, because I'm sure you'll understand that having a long exposure like a second allows more light to reach the film or sensor than 1,000th of a second. So just because this number's bigger, don't be deceived thinking it's going to let in more light. It's not. And the third and final element of the exposure triangle is ISO. the sensitivity of your sensor or film. Now, if you've got a small number, it means low sensitivity, but it will give you a nice, clear, smooth image. If you have a high number, it means you're going to get a lot faster shutter speeds out of it, so it's a lot faster at reacting to light, but there is a payoff, and that payoff is digital noise. With film, we call it grain. If we think digitally though for a minute, think about your sensor is like a microphone, and if you're recording a quiet sound, you might have to turn the volume up, and if you turn the volume up, so you turn any background noise up or electrical interference. An ISO is very similar to this. As you turn up the sensitivity of your sensor, if there's any background noise, if there's any electrical interference, you're going to turn this up as well. So what does ISO look like in real terms? Well, these were all shot with a Canon 6D, and this is all the ISO, the whole stop ISOs from 100 all the way through to 25,600. And I'm sure you're looking at these going, well, Dave, they all look pretty good to me. And that's because if you have a problem and you're looking at it through an image that's small, then that problem's going to look very small. But once you increase that image size, so you increase the problem, as you can see here. Here it's nice and smooth, but here it's definitely starting to get some digital noise. So remember, low number, low sensitivity, finer quality of the images. But let's move in even closer. And you can see here, nice and smooth as we saw before, not quite as smooth, and definitely digital noise. But more importantly, there's detail, lots of detail here in this ceramic. Starting to lose some of that detail? You've definitely lost the detail here. Now there are programs out there that will definitely bring this back and make it nice and smooth, but they won't bring back that lost detail. So be careful about using a higher ISO. But I'm not saying you can't use a higher ISO at all. If you're photographing someone in a darker environment, but you need that shot, let's say a bride and groom in a church, and they definitely want that shot of them exchanging rings, then you know that you have to up the ISO, because it's more important that you lose this finer detail and get the shot of them exchanging rings than not having the shot at all. So, which one you use? It's up to you. Correct exposure. Well, that's the best one, isn't it? Here we go. So let's assume that ISO stays the same. So that sensitivity staying the same. Like buying a roll of film, it stays the same. And this is my correct exposure. It's the same exposure. So if I have a small number, which is a big hole, that's a lot of light getting through, the majority of that exposure is made up of the hole, the aperture. So I need a very fast shutter speed to make up the rest of it. But if I have a very small hole, that's making up a very small amount of my exposure. So I need a very slow shutter speed to make up the rest of it. So f2.8 at 1,000th of a second lets in the same amount of light as f22 at a 15th of a second. As f11 at a 60th of a second. Here's another way of putting it on my favourite seesaw. So as the seesaw points to f16, it also points to a 15th of a second. So f16 at a 15th of a second lets in the same amount of light as f2 at a 1,000th of a second. You again have to decide which ones to use. And as I said before, don't worry. Why would you want to change these? I will explain that in later PowerPoints. The next PowerPoint you might want to watch is what's a stop. But for now, thanks for listening. And remember, did you get what you wanted out of this session? If you didn't, then please do ask me some questions. Get in contact I'm Dave Mann. Either contact Teams or you can email me at djman@falmouth.ac.uk. Until then, thanks very much.